a fight for England's glory land, when we have to show them what we need.
For many, Canada's role in World War I marks the beginning of nationhood, when Canada took on a new place in the world stage. Today, the war seems a long time ago, and we have to ask, what did we learn from it? What did so many die for? The world in 1914 was dominated by large empires. It was an age of imperialism. The British, German, Italian, Austrian, and Turkish empires were trying to extend their territories and had built up large armies and navies. The empires were armed to the teeth with new weapons and artillery. Europe was divided into two power blocs. Germany, Italy, and the Empire of Austria-Hungary were in an alliance called the Triple Alliance. France, Russia, and Great Britain were in an alliance formed in 1907 called the Triple Entente. The alliances were intended to provide security, but instead, they meant that a conflict between two countries ended up dragging everyone into war. In 1914, while on a visit to Sarajevo in Bosnia, Archduke Ferdinand, who was the next successor to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a Serbian fanatic. No one could have guessed that this single act would lead to a 4-year world war and millions of deaths. Austria declared war on Serbia, and the alliances clicked into place until Russia, Germany, and France were at war. When Germany attacked France through Belgium, Britain, committed to defending Belgium's neutrality, also entered the war. All the great European powers were now at war. In every capital, soldiers marched to the cheers of crowds. The World War began with celebration. Canadian Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden immediately offered assistance to Britain. Canada was still officially bound by British foreign policy, so when Britain declared war, Canada was automatically at war. Canada was ill-prepared to fight a war, with a regular army of only 3,000 men and a fledgling navy. Colonel Sam Hughes, the Minister of Militia, created a huge training camp at Valcartier outside Quebec City and called for 25,000 volunteers. 32,000 turned up. Within 2 months of the outbreak of war, 33,000 hastily trained Canadian troops sailed for Britain for further training. With them went a unit from Newfoundland, still an independent British colony. Over the next 4 years, another 400,000 men would follow them. Sandom Graves recalls his departure from Victoria, BC.
As long as I live, I shall never forget that day. Victoria had turned out to the last man, woman, and child. Even the dogs were there marching. We were all excited and embarrassed at being cheered, not having done anything yet.
Doug Smith wrote,
You secretly wondered if you would ever see home again. You couldn't get out of your mind the strained look on your mother's face as she said goodbye. You didn't want to think about it, but you couldn't help wondering about your girl. Will she wait for me?
Many would not see their loved ones again. For the men volunteering, war was considered a glorious and heroic adventure, a moral crusade against a villainous enemy.
Good luck to the boys of the Allies, just steer them on their way. The Union Jacks they're proud of, while fighting day by day. When the band plays that Aldrich Parade, there's joy right in their eyes.
Leslie Frost wrote,
You know, the war, of course, would be over in 3 months. War was still a chivalrous, romantic thing. The awful casualties of modern warfare were not even suspected.
But on the battlefields, the plans for quick victories had gone hopelessly wrong. Within 2 months of the start of the war, France lost 500,000 men. None of the generals or the soldiers had anticipated the effects of modern machines of war, now being used for the first time. On both sides, the generals based their strategies on major offensives. But the attacks proved futile against the trenches and large guns. As attack after attack failed to penetrate the enemy trench lines, the toll in human lives grew rapidly. The area between the opposing trenches was called no man's land, blasted with shells, covered with barbed wire, and littered with bodies. The armies were deadlocked along 2 great trench lines. On the Eastern Front, Russia was stalemated against Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the Western Front, where the Canadians did most of their fighting, trenches stretched from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, almost 1,000 kilometers away. For the next 4 years, the trench lines changed very little. The 1st Canadian Division reached France in the spring of 1915. They had a lot to learn. Their commanders were inexperienced. The Ross rifle, standard Canadian issue, often jammed when used in the mud with rapid fire or when soldiers used the standard British bullets. In April 1915, the Canadian 1st Division had to learn the hard way at Ypres. The Germans had developed a new weapon to try to break the stalemate, poison gas, used for the first time at Ypres. The gas devastated the French defenses, leaving a 4-mile gap in the Allied line. Canadian and British troops fought all night to close the gap. Major General Odlum described it this way.
The gas was dreadful and suffering was immediate. The only thing we could do was soak our handkerchiefs in urine and hold them over our noses. Thousands were lying around, gasping and crying. They were being drowned by the gas. They didn't know how to protect themselves. But we held our position.
Despite the gas, the Canadians held the trench lines, and in their first action on a European battlefield, won a reputation as a tough fighting force. But the cost was high. In just 48 hours, Canada lost 1 man in 3 from her fighting force. Canada soon abandoned the Ross rifle for the British Lee Enfield rifle. Over the next 3 years, the Allies launched 11 full-scale offensives against the Western Front, all part of the same strategy idea, to break through and win the war quickly. The result was devastating. In every attack, wave after wave of men were cut down by machine gun fire. The casualty lists rose steadily, but the generals refused to abandon their outmoded military traditions and continued to rely on massive head-on infantry assaults. Thomas Russell described the experience of going over the top.
Thank goodness, in an action like this, you seem to lose your senses. A kind of elevation above all ordinary feelings comes over you, and you feel as though you were rushing through air. There's so much to frighten you that you cease to be afraid.
Troops were rotated between the front lines and the supporting trenches. The front lines were the most dangerous. They took the brunt of the shelling and gunfire. Movement into no man's land was fraught with danger from snipers. At dawn and dusk, all men stood on guard, since these were the most likely times for an attack. For the soldier, life in the trenches was a test of endurance. Richard Musman put it this way.
They could not keep warm, and they could not keep clean. Their bodies crawled with lice, and rats swarmed everywhere. There was always plenty of food for the rats, for they fed upon the dead bodies. The men who died in no man's land could not always be buried. It was not safe to go out and fetch them. And even the wounded could not always be brought to safety. The men in the trenches had to listen to the cries of their dying comrades. They had to smell the blood and rotting bodies. for the guns hardly ever stopped firing, day or night. High explosive shells fell upon the dugouts and buried men alive. Shrapnel shells burst in the air, spraying their deadly splinters above the open trenches. Even more terrifying than the crash of the explosions was the noise the shells made as they flew through the air.
In September of 1915, the 2nd Division joined the Canadian Corps. They settled into a dismal winter with snow or rain filling their trenches. A soldier's letter home recorded,
This war goes on day and night, week in and week out. It is continuous for over 250 miles on this front alone. We fight on the earth, in the earth, under the earth, and in the air overhead. One of our chaps, in writing home, dated his letter, "Somewhere in Hell." He was not far out.
The men faced these conditions with camaraderie and courage. William Byrd.
The war changed men mightily. Down in the dugouts where there was hardly room to breathe, men who came from comfortable homes moved without complaint. The men were unselfish, each with a balance and discipline of his own. We endured much.
One of the hardest things to escape was the mud. In the mud and rain, the men suffered a painful condition called trench foot, as well as frostbite, colds, influenza, rats, and lice. Herbert Wood.
One of the more exasperating absurdities of dress was the kilt, and no fewer than 8 Canadian battalions wore it. Heavily pleated, the kilt was a happy haven for vermin. It could not be cleaned properly under battlefield conditions. All men smelt in the line, but none gave off so basic an odor as a kilted Highlander.
Lewis Keane wrote,
We live mostly on bully beef and hardtack, a kind of dog biscuit. We always wondered why they were so particular about a man's teeth in the army. Well, now I know. It's on account of these biscuits. The chief ingredient is, I think, cement. And they taste that way, too.
In the summer of 1915, after the Battle of Ypres, Prime Minister Borden visited England and came away convinced of the need to find more recruits. On New Year's Day, 1916, he promised England another 500,000 soldiers at a time when Canada's population was only 8 million. Despite the growing casualty lists, enthusiasm for the war remained high on the Canadian home front. Soldiers' letters home were censored, and news of the realities of war was slow to filter home. Enlistment campaigns saw the 3rd and 4th Divisions formed by mid-1916. To finance its war effort, the government appealed to Canadians for money in the form of war loans. To their surprise, the money poured in and continued to come in from ordinary citizens throughout the war. Propaganda posters, literature, and films were aimed at motivating people to support the war effort and encouraging men to enlist. In this melodrama, the Germans are portrayed bombing a field hospital. The film aims to encourage people to put their money into war loans. French Canadians at first supported the war, but quickly became disillusioned over what they saw as Britain's war. Although there were some notable exceptions, attempts to recruit French Canadians were largely failures, mainly because of bitterness over the battle of French language education in Ontario and the West. The war transformed Canadian industry. As Britain's need for ammunition grew, Canada created an entirely new munitions industry. By the end of the war, It was the biggest business in Canada, making ships, planes, bombs, chemicals, and millions of artillery shells. The war also saw new roles for women. With a shortage of men in the workforce, women filled the gaps, working in jobs previously thought of as being men's jobs. They were, however, paid considerably less than men in the same positions. Women ran farms and played a large role in patriotic efforts. Thousands of Canadian nurses served at home and overseas in field hospitals and with the Red Cross. At home, with new perceptions of women's roles, suffragettes began to campaign for the right to vote. In 1917, the Royal Flying Corps opened flying schools in Canada. And by the time the war ended, a quarter of the pilots in British planes were Canadians. Canadian pilots like Billy Bishop, W.G. Barker and Roy Brown became ace flyers and household names in Canada as war heroes. Over the course of the war, airplane technology advanced rapidly, and Canadian pilots played a significant role in the newly developed bombers and fighters. Canadians were also involved at sea. When the war began, Canada made the decision to concentrate her war effort on the Army. However, by the end of the war, the new Canadian Navy had over 100 ships. Some 8,000 Canadians served in both her own ships and in Britain's Royal Navy. Back in France, Canada's 3rd and 4th Divisions joined their comrades for the bloodiest battles of the war. In July 1916, still convinced that the war would only be won by wearing the enemy out by attack, the British began the Somme offensive. In broad daylight, the British sent wave after wave of men over the top of the trenches into German fire. The German army had long been forewarned of the attack. It was a slaughter. In one day, 57,000 men were killed or wounded. A French lieutenant.
Humanity must be mad to do what it is doing. What scenes of horror and carnage. Hell cannot be so terrible.
In one day, the 1st of July, the Newfoundland Regiment was virtually wiped out at Beaumont-Hamel. Canadians were spared the first battles along the River Somme, but in August they were sent from the muddy fields of Flanders to the Somme. The Somme became known to the Germans as Das Blutbad, the bloodbath.
If hell is as bad as what I've seen, I would not wish my worst enemy to go there,
wrote Canadian Thomas Tremblay. The Allies lost 600,000 men in all to gain 13 kilometers of muddy, shell-blasted land at the Somme. It cost Canada 24,000 casualties, but it was here that Canadians confirmed their reputation as hard-hitting troops. Led by the able British Lieutenant General Sir Julian Byng, Canadians became marked as stormtroops. Early in 1917, the Germans withdrew to the Hindenburg Line, exchanging a long, bulging trench line for a shorter, fortified one. As the Allies prepared to launch another major offensive, Canadians made elaborate preparations for an assault on Vimy Ridge, a vital key in Germany's defense system. Canadian commanders had learnt bitter lessons and prepared thoroughly. They made a model of Vimy Ridge and rehearsed their soldiers. They built tunnels and light railways and roads to supply heavy artillery to the front lines. The well-planned attack saw the Canadians capture Vimy Ridge within 4 days. Larry Worthington put it this way.
The resounding victory, the first in Britain's 2.5 years of war, and it gave every man a feeling of pride. A national spirit was born, and now to be British was not enough. We were Canadian, and could do a good job of paddling our own canoe.
Herbert Wood.
I never felt like a Canadian until Vimy. After that, I was Canadian all the way. We had a feeling that we could not lose, and if the other Allies packed it up, we could do the whole job ourselves.
The maple leaf, our emblem, the maple leaves forever. God save our King and heaven bless. The maple leaves forever.
The capture of German trenches meant taking prisoners of war. For many, this meant coming face to face with German soldiers, described by propaganda as the malicious and cruel enemy. A Canadian soldier wrote,
We saw our first prisoner of war, but could not believe what we saw. Not after what we had heard and read. He was not a square head with a double chin on the back of his neck, a spiked helmet low on his head, and a big pipe in his mouth. He was just an average young man, who could have been one of us. Was neither arrogant nor cringing. Showed us snapshots of what we took to be his wife and child.
The British commanding officer Byng was promoted following the Battle of Vimy, and command of the Canadian Corps for the first time went to a Canadian, Lieutenant General Arthur Currie. The force was now truly Canadian. Currie was a resourceful and respected commander. More than once he risked his career by protesting at decisions from British command that he felt would result in loss of life for his men. In 1917, the British resolved on one more drive and ordered the Canadian Corps to prepare for the capture of Passchendaele. General Currie inspected the area and protested that the operation was impossible without heavy cost, but he was overruled. The Passchendaele attack went ahead, and Currie's fears of 16,000 Canadian casualties proved frighteningly accurate. John Swetnam.
It was as if a powerful flood had swept over the entire landscape, snapping off the trees and destroying everything in its path. Human remains lay on every side. A disgusting odor of sickly, sweet-smelling death pressed heavily on the senses.
For the wounded, conditions were primitive, and field hospitals were overwhelmed. Surgeons and nurses worked long hours, doing what they could for the unending lines of wounded. Thomas Russell.
A few surgeons were at work upon them. The smell of fresh, warm blood was thick on the air. One man lay deep in his blood. You could not have supposed that anyone had so much in him. Another's head had lost all human semblance, and was a hideous pulp of eye and ear and jaw. Another, with chest torn open, lay gasping for the few minutes left of life. And as I waited for the ambulance, more were brought in. And always more.
As the casualty lists and news of the true nature of the war began to filter home, Canadians began to listen. By the end of 1916, recruitment was rapidly tailing off. There were a number of reasons for this. Many of the keenest had joined early in the war. Also, because of the manpower shortage, wages at home were the best they had ever been. Cut off from the wheat fields of Russia, Europe looked to Canada for grain. Getting the best prices ever for their grain, farmers were keeping their sons at home. Borden was convinced that Canada could not replace her losses with volunteers, and in 1917 he introduced the Military Service Act, paving the way for conscription. The issue bitterly divided the country, with French Canadians opposing conscription. Henri Bourassa, spokesperson for the Quebec Nationalists, declared,
No conscription, no enlistment. Canada has done enough.
The issue also split the government and became the major issue of an upcoming election. Borden's government pushed through two laws, one giving Canadian soldiers serving overseas the vote, and another giving some women the vote, but initially only the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of servicemen. These moves were designed to ensure votes in favor of the conscription party. Despite the lack of support from French Canadians, Borden won a narrow majority. Conscription was introduced in early 1918, but by the time the first conscripts were sent to France, the war was nearly over. By 1917, both sides were starting to run out of men. The wasteful battles of the early war had killed millions for little gain. To break the stalemate, the Germans and the Allies both found new ways of attacking. For the attack on Cambrai in November 1917, the Allies brought out their solution: massed tanks. Originally trialed at the Somme, this was the first effective tank attack in history. Attacking without the usual artillery barrage, 400 tanks smashed through the surprised Germans and reached the open country beyond the trenches. Unfortunately, there weren't enough men to exploit the gains, and the Germans managed to halt the attack. But the attack proved the real value of tank warfare. In 1918, the Germans came up with a surprise of their own. The collapse of Russia had freed up hundreds of thousands of German troops for use against the West, and they had developed a new method of attack. Called infiltration, small groups of crack assault troops attacked Allied trenches where they were weakest and followed the line of least resistance as far as they could. The German offensive of 1918 shattered the Allied front and drove the Allied armies back to within 40 miles of Paris. But the Allies did not break, and the German attack came to a halt. The last great German gamble had failed. Then the Allies launched their own counterattack. Assisted by hundreds of tanks and the newly arrived American troops, the Allies pushed the exhausted German armies back over the ground they had so recently won. Flanked by Australian and French troops and supported by tanks, the Canadian Corps advanced rapidly despite strong opposition. August 4th to November 11th, 1918 has come to be known as Canada's 100 Days because of Canada's role in the final push. Belgian, British, French, American, Australian, and Canadian divisions assaulted the German lines, and by the end of September, the German army was in retreat all along the Western Front. At 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, the war ended for the Canadians when they finally reached the Belgian town of Mons. It was here that British and German soldiers had first clashed in 1914. Armistice Day in 1918 brought the war to a close. The war-weary world celebrated at last. Later that year, the first Canadian soldiers sailed for home. In early 1919, the international leaders gathered at Versailles to set out the conditions for peace. Prime Minister Borden attended, despite American and French perceptions that Canada was just a British puppet. Borden's insistence that Canada have a separate seat at the conference and in the new League of Nations gave her a new role in world affairs and international prestige. "65 million soldiers fought in World War I. At least 10 million soldiers died, and many million more civilians. Another 29 million soldiers were missing, wounded, or captured. The final cost ran into hundreds of billions of dollars. It was the most colossal war in human history." Canadian soldier Richard Watt.
The true horror of World War I was not in its maimed and killed, and not in the length of the war, and not in its barbarism and atrocities. It was in the fact that so many men died and achieved nothing by it.
Canadians had fought not only in France, but in the Atlantic, the Middle East, Egypt, and against the Russian communists in North Russia and Siberia. With a population of only 8 million, Canada had sent 620,000 men and women to war. 66,000 died, nearly 1 in 10. Canada had won a measure of national self-confidence from her war effort through the valor of her troops and the strength of her industries. Canadians clearly began to perceive themselves as being a nation separate from Britain. But the war to end all wars did not prevent the world from going to war again in 1939. And too many had paid too high a price.
We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie, in Flanders fields.
Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the water to be.